The Germans had been fighting for 4 years before the first American Marines stepped onto a European battlefield in significant numbers. 4 years of Poland, of France, of the grinding Eastern Front, of North Africa, of campaigns that had produced some of the most battle-hardened soldiers in the history of modern warfare. They had faced the British Army, the French Foreign Legion, Soviet troops who fought with a ferocity born from desperation, and a dozen other opponents who had given them real competition. They thought they knew what a soldier looked like, how he behaved under fire, what his limits were, and how far you had to push before those limits broke. They were wrong about the Marines. The accounts that survived from German soldiers and officers who encountered United States Marines in combat across both world wars form one of the most remarkable bodies of testimony in military history. They are remarkable not because they are uniformly flattering, though many of them are, and not because they tell a simple story of American invincibility, because the Marines lost battles too and paid dearly for ground taken. They are remarkable because of what they reveal about the specific quality of the encounter, the particular way in which German professional soldiers processed the experience of fighting against men from a country they had often dismissed as militarily naive. The first major encounter between German forces and United States Marines in a World War setting came in June of 1918 at Belleau Wood, a forested hunting ground in northeastern France that would give its name to one of the most consequential small unit engagements in American military history. The context matters enormously. The German spring offensive of 1918 had torn through Allied lines with a violence that had not been seen since the early days of the war. French units in some sectors had broken entirely. The road to Paris was less firmly closed than it had been, and the urgency of the Allied position was reflected in the orders American forces received to hold ground that military logic suggested could not be held. The Marines who arrived at Belleau Wood were not veterans. They had not yet seen significant combat. They were well trained by the standards of the American military of the time, possessed of a regimental culture that emphasized aggression and individual marksmanship, and led by officers who transmitted a specific attitude about what Marines did when they met an enemy. They attacked. The French Army liaison officer who encountered retreating French troops near Belleau Wood and suggested to the Marine commander that discretion might be advisable received one of the most quoted responses in Marine Corps history. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. Whether those were the exact words or a cleaned-up version of something more colorful, the attitude they expressed was genuine and about to be demonstrated. The battle that followed lasted most of June 1918 and cost the Marines casualties that the Corps had never before experienced in a single engagement. But what German forces on the receiving end of those attacks described in their after-action reports and personal communications was something that went beyond the tactical outcome of specific engagements. They described soldiers who seemed genuinely indifferent to the losses they were taking, who attacked across open ground under machine gun fire that should have stopped any rational assault, were cut down in numbers that would have caused any other unit to go to ground and wait for support, and then attacked again and again. German Lieutenant Ernst Otto, serving with the 237th Division during the Belleau Wood fighting, wrote in a report that circulated through German intelligence channels and was later captured and translated. His description of Marine assault tactics was clinical but contained something beneath the clinical language that could only be called unease. The Americans, he wrote, attack with an enthusiasm and an apparent disregard for their own losses that is unlike anything we have encountered on the Western Front. They do not appear to recognize that their situation is hopeless. When a position cannot be taken, they do not withdraw and reconsolidate. They press against it until they are destroyed or until it falls. This is not tactics. It is something else. We have not found a name for it yet. The German High Command's assessment of the Marines at Belleau Wood went through several revisions as the battle progressed. Initial reports in early June 1918 dismissed the American forces as inexperienced troops who would break under sustained pressure, a prediction that seemed reasonable given what German forces had seen from other Allied units in the spring offensive's aftermath. When that prediction failed to materialize, when Marine units continued attacking days and weeks into a battle that should, by conventional measures, have ended with an American withdrawal, the assessments became more serious and more specific in their concern. A German intelligence report from June 26, 1918, the day the last significant German resistance in Belleau Wood was overcome, described the Marines in language that was reproduced in German military publications and distributed as a warning to units that might face American forces in subsequent operations. The report called the Marines Teufelhunden, devil dogs, a term that carried connotations of ferocity and unnatural determination. Whatever the precise weight of the original German, the name stuck, and the Marines embraced it, because it captured something about how their opponents experienced them that they recognized as accurate. What German soldiers said about the Marines went beyond the formal language of intelligence reports and after-action assessments. The personal letters and diaries of German soldiers at Belleau Wood that have been recovered and translated over the following century reveal a more intimate and more visceral reaction to the encounter. A letter from a German corporal identified only as Conrad H. in records from the 28th Division described his unit's experience of a Marine night attack. "They came through the dark making sounds we didn't understand," he wrote, "and they kept coming after we opened fire as if the bullets weren't hitting them. 3 of our men broke and ran, and I cannot say I didn't consider it. There is something wrong with men who fight that way. They either don't know they can die, or they don't care." The specific qualities that German soldiers identified repeatedly in their descriptions of Marines came down to a small number of consistent themes: physical aggression that seemed to exceed tactical necessity, marksmanship that was genuinely exceptional, reflecting the Marine Corps' long-standing emphasis on rifle qualification as a fundamental professional standard, a unit cohesion under pressure that maintained offensive capability, even when casualty rates would have disrupted the command structure of a less resilient organization, and a relationship to fear that German observers consistently described as abnormal, as somehow outside the range of responses that professional soldiers had been trained to expect from opponents. The Second World War brought Marine Corps and German forces into direct contact primarily in North Africa and Italy, theaters where the Corps operated alongside Army units in ways that sometimes made attribution of specific engagement outcomes difficult. But there are recorded instances of German prisoners and captured officers commenting specifically on Marine units they had faced or been briefed about, and those comments follow patterns consistent with the First World War record. A German officer captured in Tunisia in early 1943 and interrogated by American intelligence described having received briefings about American Marine formations from officers who had studied First World War records. His summary of those briefings was recorded in the interrogation transcript. "We were told," he said, "that the Marines are not typical American soldiers, that they have a different relationship to combat than other forces, that they should be expected to do things that other units would not do, and to sustain losses that would stop other units. We were told to be careful about dismissing early reports of Marine behavior as exaggeration." The Italian campaign produced a set of encounters that added further German testimony to the record. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, who were among the finest infantry Germany fielded and who had fought on every major front, encountered Marine units in several engagements and left accounts that were notable for the respect they expressed. German paratroopers were not men who gave respect easily. They had earned their own reputation through engagements with British, Soviet, and other Allied forces. And they had a professional culture that valued toughness and aggression in ways that mirrored the Marine Corps' own values more closely than almost any other German formation. The mutual recognition that passed between these two groups of elite infantry when they encountered each other was documented in German regimental histories and in the memoirs of surviving Fallschirmjäger officers. Major Rudolf Böhmler, a Fallschirmjäger officer who served in Italy and later wrote an account of German airborne operations, described the Marine Corps in terms that his own background gave particular weight. He wrote that the Marines possessed what he called the assault spirit, in a degree that he had encountered in very few formations on any front. He distinguished this quality from simple bravery, noting that bravery without discipline produces ineffective soldiers, and that the Marines combined an aggression that bordered on recklessness with a tactical discipline and marksmanship that made the aggression effective rather than merely costly. He expressed particular admiration for Marine small unit leadership, noting that Marine sergeants and junior officers maintained offensive capability and unit coherence under conditions that would have produced paralysis in less resilient formations. The rifle, and specifically the Marine Corps' relationship with the rifle as the fundamental individual weapon, came up repeatedly in German accounts of encounters with Marines. German infantry doctrine had evolved toward an emphasis on the machine gun as the primary fire support weapon, with riflemen providing supporting roles. Marine units maintained a much higher emphasis on individual rifle marksmanship than German practice considered optimal. The results in engagements at ranges where individual aimed fire was decisive surprised German soldiers who had been trained to expect that suppressive machine gun fire would dominate. Marine riflemen who could engage targets at ranges and with an accuracy that exceeded German infantry expectations disrupted tactical assumptions that German units had built around the idea that individual American soldiers would be average marksmen at best. The psychological effect of facing Marines was something German officers addressed in after-action reports with a directness that reflected genuine professional concern. The disruption to unit morale that came from fighting an opponent who seemed to be playing by different rules, who attacked when withdrawal was the logical choice, who held positions under fire that should have forced abandonment, who continued functioning as a cohesive unit after losses that would have broken other formations, was a specific tactical problem that went beyond the purely physical challenge of enemy firepower. German medical officers noted elevated rates of stress casualties in units that had sustained extended contact with Marine formations, and attributed this specifically to the psychological experience of facing opponents whose behavior violated trained expectations. One German division commander, whose post-war memoir was translated and studied by American military historians, described the experience of receiving intelligence reports about approaching Marine units before an engagement with a frankness that he said he would not have admitted while the war was still in progress. He wrote that the specific identification of Marine units in his sector changed his planning assumptions in ways that the identification of Army units did not. He allocated heavier defensive resources, established deeper fallback positions, and briefed his officers to expect attacks at times and under conditions that other opponents would not have attempted. He described this not as fear, but as professional respect, the kind of adjustment that a serious soldier makes when he knows his opponent is also serious. He added, with a dry humor that came through even in translation, that the Marines had never given him reason to regret those extra precautions. The tradition of German professional testimony about Marine Corps effectiveness continued beyond the Second World War. Bundeswehr officers who had served in the Wehrmacht brought a comparative perspective to Cold War joint exercises with Marines that was historically unique. They had faced the Marines, or faced forces that had faced them and reported back. And when they watched Marines train decades later, they were watching through eyes that held a specific historical reference point. The assessments they offered in private professional conversation drew directly on that reference, and the consistent thread running through those assessments was the same one that had appeared in the intelligence reports from Belleau Wood in 1918. There is something about the way these men are made that falls outside the normal range of what soldiers do. The picture that emerges from all of this testimony across more than a century is not one of supernatural soldiers who cannot be defeated. Marines have been defeated. They have retreated. They have made tactical errors and paid for them. The record of German accounts of facing Marines is not a record of invincibility. It is something more interesting and more durable. A record of consistent professional respect from opponents who were themselves professionals of the highest order. A recognition that something in the training, the culture, and the self-conception of the Marine Corps produced a kind of soldier that forced adjustment in people who had built their own military identity around the assumption that they were the standard by which other soldiers should be measured. The Germans called them devil dogs, and they meant it as a warning. The Marines heard it as a compliment. That exchange, across a century of military history, tells you almost everything you need to know about both sides.